do we pronounce it? GeVentor?
GeVentor.
GeVentor. Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like some kind of, I don't know, character from Star Wars.
Robot, yeah.
Yeah.
So Committee for Ballarat's role started with the ventilator project one Sunday afternoon when I was talking to a very good mate of mine who's the head of ICU at Ballarat Base Hospital. And this is now some weeks ago, and the concern at that stage was that the health system's going to be overrun. We haven't got access to enough equipment. Ventilators is a critical part of that equipment supply. We're at the end of the supply chain. The rest of the world needs them. We're going to be in strife. So Monday morning, I picked up the phone to Elizabeth and Sandy Lewis-Gray to say, look, there's this possibility here that we're going to be in a bit of strife with ventilators. Who do you know around town who might be able to turn their attention to it? And Sandy straight away said, yeah, I think I can. Leave it with me for a couple of days. And I didn't think too much about it. That was Monday morning. Thursday afternoon, Elizabeth rings me and says, look, Sandy's got a working prototype. We'd like you to come out and have a look at it. And I said, what do you mean? She said, oh, no, look, he's been tinkering around in the shed and he thinks he can make it work with adapting some of the technologies that we've used as part of our jig work 20 years ago. Wow, okay, so let's go out and have a look. And they were excited and clearly a very rudimentary model meant that they had a lot of work to do. And our role was just, I offered our role to say, look, we can help connect you with various people around the region and the state potentially to develop this further. So the genesis really was a conversation about, we think we're going to be overrun. We don't think we're going to have enough equipment. How might we get more? And, you know, Sandy saying, let me have a crack at seeing what I can do. And hence, here we are.
How did you deal with the challenges that these sort of, the urgency threw up?
The urgency in the early days was really critical. And what we knew was going to be the stumbling block was TGA, Therapeutic Goods Association approval. So really quickly we had to get on to how do you navigate TGA processes? And it was fortuitous, and there's a whole range of fortunate stories that come out of innovation, isn't there? But it was fortuitous that there was a guy from Perth whose girlfriend lives in Ballarat. He'd been here visiting, couldn't get back to Perth because flights were being cancelled. It just so happened he works as a consultant in Perth for medical tech companies to navigate TGA processes. And he saw on LinkedIn a post that Elizabeth had put up saying, you know, here's some things they're thinking about. Sandy's been playing around with the shed. This is what it looks like. Who can help? And this guy literally responded to the post on LinkedIn and said, well, actually, I work in this space. I'm here for a couple of weeks. How can I help? That was, I think, Thursday before Easter. Good Friday, we pulled together a team of the Gekko engineers together with Sandy, Elizabeth and Jack from Perth to say, okay, well, what does TGA approval look like? What do we need to do urgently to try and put ourselves on the map in this regard? And, you know, again, that's kind of how it started. It really was as simple as that. But the urgency was critical because firstly, we had to try and find some government funding. And to do that, we needed some support funding from the community. And secondly, that we knew that the bureaucracy of TGA was pretty substantial. So you had to get on that from the get-go. So state government jumping on board to say, yeah, look, we think we can find some money for you. Some fantastic community benefactors who said, we love the idea of this, let's see what can happen out of it. And then our TGA connection, which was again, just happened to be in Ballarat at the time. Really critical to this, Nichola, is that Sandy had always recognised that he had a level of knowledge around the technical elements of what a ventilator did. We needed to be able to access specialist knowledge in medical sense, and I can talk about that. But the other part was, okay, how do you build this now that doesn't rely on having to source supply from overseas? It clearly wasn't coming through. So what can you find off the shelf? And if you haven't got it off the shelf, how do you make it? 3D printing. Hey, there's a 3D printer here in Ballarat at Runway. There's some expertise down there. Let's utilise that to see, particularly in terms of the prototyping, how might we use the services of Runway to assist in some of that development work. So the design work was happening really quickly, but there was a sense of, well, you can't go and get parts from overseas or componentry. You can't go and get that overseas unless you've got access to it here. How do we access local partnerships? And hence the Runway one was a pretty important one. I actually think that the benefit of a ventilator project is not going to necessarily be 1,000, 100, 10,000 ventilators. I think the benefit of it will be is that you can innovate in a way that collaborates with a whole range of other organisations, do it quickly and turn your mind to something else. So could Ballarat become a hub for medical technology? Absolutely. So you can show that you can move really quickly with collaborative thinking and problem-solving approaches. And that doesn't happen if you just say, look, we're good at making these widgets, and that's what we do. We make this widget. It happens when you sort of put aside that model and say, let's think about what we can solve and how we can do it and who we need to involve to get that happening, which is the collaborative workspace that Runway is. So I think the thing's really, really closely connected.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a beautiful example of that we all need to, as even as a species, really move beyond what we do know and trust that others know things that we don't know, and that's okay. And that actually builds on the success of everything that we do, and we can be better when we do it together. And not to quote Pete in here, but I mean, Pete's always saying a rising tide floats all boats. Like, that's our motto. And I think that the ventilator was a perfect example of that the community working together comes to great things.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, with the ventilator as an example, that there was real scepticism at the bureaucracy at state government about whether these guys were capable of doing that. It was almost like, we'll throw you a little bit of money and say, good luck to you. But they've taken that on board and said, no, let's prove that we can do things differently. So just because we're not a medical tech company doesn't mean we can't. Just because we haven't been part of your normal procurement chain doesn't mean that we can't deliver on this stuff. And we'll do it with collaborative problem solving and really innovative design.
And there's nothing like someone telling you can't do something to make sure you do a really good job of it too.
Look, innovation in Ballarat has been a really interesting thing to see over this course of the last couple of months, and there's some great examples of which Gekko and its partnerships has been one. The other one that's really interesting is Haynes Paint, who have turned their skills to developing hand sanitisers to meet the demand that was there. And they'll very quickly, within literally a week, be able to turn out hand sanitisers. Deutsche Mowers, a great family-owned business here in Ballarat for generations, have produced, I think it's something like 2,000 beds for the hospital network, and they're now looking at a contract into the US to supply the US with hospital beds. On a different but very similar in terms of this innovation, if you look at some of our hospitality industries and what they've done to turn their attention towards dealing in a COVID environment, one of which is what's called Eat, Drink, West, which was about sourcing the wonderful produce that were being grown in the region that typically would have had outlets through restaurants and events into take-home boxes for people. Now, whilst that's not necessarily innovative, what we saw was that the Ballarat community had very little understanding of where local produce and the quality of local produce that was being produced, and no access to getting that. So this ability to take from the plate to market, or to market from the paddock, was really important. So, Deutsche Mowers, really great story. Haynes Paint, great story. Gekko, they're the sort of things that if you can enable innovation with really good leadership and where it's required some regulatory framework and potentially some government support, then a whole range of things can happen. I think the future has to look at what the 21st century solutions are going to be, and we have to resign 20th century thinking to history. So if I try and put some meat on the bones on that, if I think about the way we get around our cities, the connectivity we have between cities and within a city, that a car has been our staple. A car has meant roads, a car has meant car parking, a car has meant congestion, a car has meant pollution. I think that's one of the innovations we have to leave behind. Now, what it means is we're not going to not have cars, but I think we have to look at ways of being able to allow cities to grow in terms of population without relying so heavily on the ways we have done things, and that is everybody has a car and gets in it and drives. So if I think about that in terms of population settlement, if we don't rely on the car, if we have great interconnectivity with mass transport, and I understand the difficulties that right now in terms of the COVID environment, but assuming we get over that, and we will, moving people quickly en masse, particularly where they don't need to go to an office every day for the same purposes at the same hours, I think opens up enormous opportunities for different ways of getting around and connecting within our cities. So, Nichola, the Runway model of a shared workspace that I might use 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, but through the rest of the week I can actually work flexibly from wherever that might be, means that I don't need to get in my car and drive it to the office the same way every day at the same time. That's the 20th century model. We need to move beyond that. So mass transport, flexible hours of work, flexible ways of being able to work, partnerships more so than just collaborations more so than conglomerations. That's the sort of scenario I think that we have to look at if we're going to be able to sustain population growth and maintain livable cities. And at the core of this, I think, is the notion of a livable city. We are growing, we have to grow, we'll continue to grow, but we can't grow exponentially unless we look at ways of doing different things about how we get around and how we work and how we live. Now, look, hopefully there's something in there for you, and I really appreciate your interest. We'll see where this goes, and we're hanging on TGA approval, and that's going to hopefully be by the end of next week.
It's fantastic.
Who knows what's possible there, so,
yeah. No, we're really pumped.
So thanks so much for today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, heaps,
talking to you
Michael.
both. Time and interest.
All right.
Good on you.
We'll
Thanks,
see you
guys.
soon.
Bye now.
Bye.